The message arrives mid-sentence, mid-bite, mid-thought. It does not ask whether you are available. It lands with a particular weight, capitalized, exclamation pointed, forwarded with a note saying, "This is urgent." And before you have read a single fact, something inside you has already moved. Your shoulders tighten. The conversation at the table fades. A pulse somewhere between chest and throat begins its quiet acceleration, and you are no longer where you were a moment ago. Someone else's speed is now running through your body. The question worth asking, the one almost nobody stops to ask in that first physical surge, is this: who set that clock? Introduction. Urgency does not always arrive as a command. Most of the time it travels quietly, embedded in a tone of voice, a particular word choice, a silence where a reply was expected, or the social weight of a person whose approval you cannot easily afford to lose. By the time the actual request becomes clear, the pressure has already been accepted. The body is already at someone else's tempo. This is not weakness or poor character. It is what happens when beings who live in relationship absorb information through every available channel simultaneously. And when the channel that carries emotional distress is, under ordinary circumstances, a reliable signal that something requires attention. The difficulty is that not everything delivered at an emergency's speed is an emergency. A colleague marking a routine task urgent because they forgot it. A family member who experiences every logistical complication as a catastrophe. A parent whose anxiety has no biological clock of its own. Each of these can transfer genuine internal pressure without transferring genuine responsibility. Feeling the weight of someone else's deadline is not the same as owning it. The sensation of urgency is real. The question of whose emergency generated it is something different entirely, and one that deserves a careful answer before action begins. This volume is called the Borrowed Hour Register because it functions as a ledger. When urgency arrives from outside, something gets written into that register. Who brought the pressure? When the deadline actually falls, who bears the consequence if nothing happens, and whether the viewer has a defined role in that outcome. The register does not teach coldness, it does not counsel refusal as a default posture. What it offers is a method for reading the entry before signing it, for knowing what you're taking on and why, and whether the speed being demanded of you belongs to the situation or to the person describing it. The chapters ahead will examine how urgency travels, how it finds its way into people whose reliability makes them natural destinations, and how a responsible adult recovers an internal sense of timing without becoming less available to the people who genuinely need them. Chapter 1. How urgency travels. Consider what happens in the seconds before you understand what someone actually needs. A colleague appears in the doorway at speed, voice already elevated, words running together. A text arrives in fragments, 3 short messages instead of 1, each arriving before the previous one can be read. A family member calls twice in quick succession, and the second call begins before you have finished processing the first. In each case, the delivery itself is doing work. The fragmentation, the acceleration, the doubled signal, these are not simply stylistic choices. They communicate something prior to any content, that the speaker is operating under pressure, and that they expect you to begin operating under pressure too. Tone, in this sense, becomes a form of evidence. It arrives before facts, before context, before the actual request, and it carries an implicit claim. The situation is as severe as my presentation of it suggests. The body responds to this claim in something very close to the way it would respond to the facts themselves. Attention narrows, lower priority concerns are set aside, decision-making shifts toward speed. All of this happens before the actual question is even formed, let alone evaluated. By the time the speaker reaches the part where they say what they need, you are already somewhere between agreement and action. The error is not in noticing another person's distress. Noticing is both natural and appropriate. The error is in treating the intensity of their delivery as reliable evidence of objective severity. Someone who is constitutionally dramatic, chronically underorganized, or genuinely terrified of a modest professional consequence can generate the same vocal and physical urgency as someone facing a genuine crisis. The pitch of delivery is a measurement of the speaker's internal state. It is not a measurement of the situation. These two things often correlate. They do not always. In workplace settings, the gap between delivery and reality tends to appear around projects whose actual deadlines were never precisely established or whose consequences were never clearly articulated. The presenter is urgent, the project is merely overdue. In family settings, the gap appears around logistical problems that have been allowed to accumulate, around health anxieties that exceed clinical evidence, or around social discomforts that have been elevated to relational crises. What these situations share is the absence of a factual examination, the missing questions. When did this become critical? What specifically happens if it waits 2 more hours? Who holds decision authority over the outcome? Without those questions, tone functions as a substitute for facts. The faster and more distressed the speaker, the more legitimate the urgency appears to feel. The gap between what is happening and what is being communicated about what is happening remains invisible. Identifying that gap is not skepticism, it is basic accuracy. The most useful thing a responsible person can do when urgency arrives at high velocity is to separate the signal from the noise, to acknowledge the distress, while quietly beginning to examine the actual situation. Every request delivered at speed carries an implicit deadline, stated or unstated. That deadline is often the element most worth inspecting, because deadlines are where pressure becomes formally organized. Before examining how emotion transfers, the more mechanical question deserves attention. Where do these deadlines actually come from? There is a particular quality to a deadline presented as simply given, already fixed, non-negotiable, beyond the reach of any conversation. It arrives as a fact of nature rather than a decision made by someone at some point. It has to be done by Friday. The window closes tonight. They need it before the meeting. The passive voice is often present because passive voice erases the agent, the person who established the deadline, the moment when it was set, and the chain of decisions that produced it. The first honest question is not when the deadline falls, but who created it. Most formal deadlines originate in a decision, a calendar entry, a contract clause, a system requirement, a regulatory schedule. These are real and they carry genuine consequence. But a significant portion of the deadlines that arrive with urgency attached were created informally, often by the same person who is now presenting them as external constraints. The manager who committed to a client timeline without consulting the team, the family member who agreed to host an event without establishing who would organize it, the colleague who told another party, "We'll have it ready," without verifying whether that was true. Each of these people produced a deadline through their own choices, and each of them may now be presenting that deadline to you as though it arrived from somewhere outside human decision. The second question is when the problem became known. This question deserves a candid answer, because the gap between when something was known and when it arrived in front of you is frequently where the real urgency was manufactured. A deadline that has been visible for 3 weeks and arrived today is a different situation from a deadline that genuinely emerged this morning. The former is a compression problem. Time that existed was not used, and the cost of that failure is now being distributed to whoever is available to absorb it. The latter is an actual late development that reasonable people could not have anticipated. Who benefits from compressing your evaluation time is the third question, and it is the one that rarely gets asked. When someone presents a deadline as immovable and immediate, the compression itself serves a function. If you examine the facts slowly, you might ask why the situation was allowed to reach this point. You might raise the question of whose responsibility the preparation actually was. You might propose an alternative that does not require your full engagement at this particular moment. Speed forecloses those questions. The person who benefits from the absence of those questions is not always the person who appears to be in the most distress. This is not an argument for suspicion. Most deadlines are not manufactured through deliberate manipulation. They are manufactured through the ordinary human tendencies toward delay, optimism about available time, and the underestimation of how long things actually take. Someone who procrastinated genuinely and is now in distress is not necessarily calculating the effect on you. They are drowning in their own poor planning and reaching for whatever is available. The pressure is real. The requirement that you absorb it without examination is not. How poor planning travels downward through organizations and families follows a reliable pattern. The person closest to the consequence, who also has the least formal power, ends up holding the compressed timeline. A senior figure delays, a mid-level person accelerates, the actual work lands on whoever can least afford to refuse. This is why the question of where a deadline came from, who created it, when and whether they had alternatives, is not an act of resistance. It is an act of accuracy, and accuracy, it turns out, is what distinguishes a response from a reaction. Not every deadline gains its force from a calendar. Some derive their urgency from the person delivering them, because when that person speaks, evaluation time shortens by a different mechanism entirely. When someone with authority over you delivers a request at speed, the normal sequence of evaluation collapses. The question, "Is this genuinely urgent?" becomes secondary to the question, "How do I appear to someone whose opinion determines something important about my situation?" A senior manager walking to your desk with a tense expression has already changed your cognitive posture before they have spoken. A parent calling late in the evening activates a different nervous architecture than a call at noon. An expert delivering a finding with clinical gravity borrows a credibility that makes the recommended speed feel like part of the diagnosis. Authority does not simply communicate importance. It contracts the time allowed for examining whether something is as important as it is being presented. The key distinction here is between legitimate command and convenience transfer. A legitimate command exists when the person with authority has both the appropriate scope to direct your time and a genuine organizational or relational reason for the urgency. A military or emergency services context has defined authority structures for exactly this reason. Time compression in those environments carries documented rationale. A workplace has authority structures, but those structures do not automatically make every rushed request legitimate. The boss who needs something now because they forgot, because they overcommitted, or because they prefer immediate compliance to having to repeat themselves, is using the same authority channel as the one who needs something now, because an actual operational consequence is unfolding. These situations look identical from the outside. They are not the same. Consider 3 common contexts. A manager requests an immediate response to something you know was neither new nor urgent as of yesterday. A parent says the family needs a decision by this evening about something that has been open for a month. A financial or medical professional presents a recommendation with urgency in a way that discourages you from asking clarifying questions. In each case, the status of the speaker functions as a substitute for the examination of facts. The manager's position suggests that disagreement would be politically costly. The parent's history suggests that delay would be emotionally costly. The professional's expertise suggests that delay would be practically costly. All 3 forms of cost are real. None of them is equivalent to the claim that the urgency itself is verified. Fear of appearing difficult is one of the most reliable mechanisms through which status transfers urgency. The person who pauses to ask clarifying questions risks being perceived as resistant, slow, uncommitted, or insufficiently loyal. In cultures that reward visible responsiveness, immediate replies, instant compliance, agile pivots, the simple act of evaluation can appear as a character flaw. Over time, the cost of that perception can outweigh, in the viewer's private calculation, the cost of accepting borrowed urgency. The evaluation is abandoned not because the facts justify speed, but because the social consequences of slowing down feel more immediate than the professional consequences of poor decisions. What status accomplishes, in practical terms, is to relocate the question. Instead of "Is this genuinely urgent?" the question becomes, "What does my response communicate about me?" This relocation is not always conscious. It happens quickly, and it is reinforced by experience, because in many cases visible responsiveness genuinely does produce rewards, and deliberate evaluation genuinely does produce friction. The pattern becomes embedded. Eventually, the evaluation step is skipped, not as a choice but as a habit. Ownership questions. Whose deadline is this? Who benefits from my speed? Who carries the consequence if nothing happens? Do not disappear because the person making the request has authority. What changes is the cost of asking them. Recognizing that cost is not the same as concluding, that the urgency is false. It is simply the beginning of an accurate reading, and accuracy is something that neither authority nor tone can replace. Status operates through institutional position, role, and social weight. There are other channels, less formal but no less effective, through which urgency travels. Some of them run directly through affection. Chapter 2. The emotional transmitters. Anxiety is visible in a way that other emotional states are not. It occupies the face, the voice, the posture, and the hands. When someone you care about is visibly distressed, the information arrives through several senses simultaneously, and the resulting pressure inside you does not feel like a transferred state. It feels like a response to something real. The distinction between those two things is subtle enough that most people never examine it. What is happening in those moments is something like this. The other person's distress is genuine, their anxiety is real, but the situation producing the anxiety is being measured entirely through their reaction to it, rather than through any direct observation of the situation itself. You are watching a distressed person, and the distress is functioning as evidence of severity. The louder and more visible the anxiety, the more certain you feel that action is required. Quickly, immediately, now. This is the mechanism. The anxiety is real. Its reliability as a measurement of external danger is another question entirely. Calming someone and validating their timetable are different actions. The first is often necessary and humane. The second may or may not be appropriate, depending on what the timetable actually represents. A parent distressed about a medical appointment that needs to be scheduled may require both genuine reassurance that you have heard the concern and a clear-eyed look at how urgent the scheduling actually is. A friend in acute distress about a relationship decision may need your presence and attention without requiring you to have an answer by the end of the hour. These distinctions are not acts of withholding. They are acts of accuracy. Family logistics offer some of the clearest examples of this dynamic. The child who needs a costume for a school event, the sibling whose apartment situation has become suddenly complicated, the parent who cannot locate an important document. Each of these situations generates visible anxiety in the person experiencing it. The anxiety is transmitted. You feel it. You begin organizing around it. But the question of when the costume is actually needed, whether the apartment situation requires your involvement this week or next, whether the document can wait until tomorrow, these questions belong to a factual inspection that the transmitted anxiety tends to preempt. Speed begins before the facts warrant it. One of the more important observations about this pattern is that rescuing someone from their anxiety, moving immediately, solving the problem before they have to sit with it, produces a reward for everyone involved. Their distress decreases. Your sense of competence and care is confirmed. The discomfort that prompted the exchange disappears. This is a short-term resolution that works so reliably that it trains repetition. Over time, the anxious person learns, not necessarily consciously, that sufficient visible distress produces movement, and the person absorbing the anxiety learns that movement reliably reduces the discomfort of witnessing it. The loop becomes self-reinforcing. Stepping back from that loop is not abandoning someone. It is refusing to let their internal state be the primary instrument by which the severity of an external situation is measured. Anxiety deserves compassion. The calibration question, how urgent is this actually and what is my role in it, deserves a separate examination, run alongside the compassion rather than replaced by it. There is a more explicit version of this mechanism that uses language rather than visible distress to do the same work. If you cared, you would answer now. The sentence is rarely delivered that plainly, but the meaning arrives in many different forms. I just thought you'd want to know. I didn't want to bother you, but I'm really struggling. I suppose I'll figure it out myself. You're the only one I can ask. Each of these is a linkage, a connection being constructed between your speed of response and your quality of care. The implicit equation is this: immediate compliance equals love. Delay equals indifference. Whatever the explicit content of the request, the emotional structure underneath it is a clock set by the definition of care. The difficulty with this structure is that it is not always wrong. Care does sometimes require speed. Love does sometimes mean setting aside your own comfort or convenience because someone genuinely needs you. The link between affection and responsiveness is real and meaningful. What guilt as a transfer mechanism exploits is the legitimacy of that real link, using it in situations where the urgency does not meet the threshold the language implies. The genuine love required to respond immediately to a medical emergency is being invoked to produce the same immediacy for something that would not qualify as urgent under any factual examination. Separating care from immediate compliance is one of the more demanding distinctions this register asks of its reader, because it requires the ability to hold two things at once: genuine affection for the person and a refusal to let that affection determine your timeline on their behalf. These do not cancel each other out. A deeply caring response can include the sentence, "I want to understand this fully before I answer. Let me think about it and come back to you this evening." That sentence is not a withdrawal of care. Its reception as a withdrawal of care is a property of the guilt transfer mechanism, not a property of the care being offered. Caregiving relationships and adult-child dynamics present particular versions of this challenge. A parent whose needs have grown with age may use the vocabulary of their former authority, combined with the vulnerability of their current situation, a combination that produces a distinctive form of guilt in adult children. A grown child whose management of their own life has remained underdeveloped may use emotional distress in a way that summons parental instincts from someone who is also, in the same moment, a full adult with their own obligations. Both situations are real. Both involve genuine affection on all sides. Neither one automatically produces a legitimate urgency claim. The roles that guilt activates are frequently old ones, patterns established in earlier versions of a relationship that no longer reflect its current structure. The adult who was once the competent older sibling, the emotional caretaker of an unstable parent, the family mediator, the reliable one, each of these roles carries a reflexive sense of duty that guilt can reach into and activate without reference to current facts. The role responds before the person does. The evaluation arrives, if at all, after the commitment is already made. What happens when decisions are made specifically to stop the discomfort of guilt is worth examining carefully. The guilt subsides. The original request is fulfilled. A temporary sense of resolution is established. But the decision itself, the actual choice, the actual commitment, was shaped primarily by the desire to end an uncomfortable internal state, rather than by a factual assessment of the situation. Over time, a pattern of guilt-driven decisions accumulates into a set of responsibilities, habits, and relational expectations that were never deliberately chosen. The person who accepted them was choosing not to feel guilt. The responsibilities themselves arrived along for the ride. This does not mean guilt is always a false signal. Guilt can reflect a genuine ethical failure, something actually owed, a commitment genuinely broken, a person genuinely abandoned when the duty was real. The work of discernment is not to silence guilt, but to ask it a question. Is the duty you are indicating something I actually owe, in this situation, on this timeline, or are you measuring someone else's distress and calling it my obligation? That question does not always resolve cleanly, but asking it is the beginning of owning the answer. Beyond guilt, there is a quieter fear that drives the same compliance. It is not the fear of having failed someone. It is the fear of what a delay would communicate about who you are. The meanings that can be attached to a pause are numerous, and none of them are flattering: selfish, unreliable, disloyal, checked out, not a team player, too busy for the people who matter. These are interpretations, not facts, but they carry the practical weight of facts because they affect relationships, professional standing, and how others speak about you when you are not in the room. The fear of being assigned one of these labels is often more motivating than the fear of any specific consequence inside the original request. The urgency is not really about the task. It is about the meaning of how quickly you respond to it. When a delayed reply is interpreted as rejection, the interpretation does the urgent person's work for them. They do not have to argue that you are unreliable. They simply act as though your slower response confirms it. The emotional pressure produced by that interpretation delivered through a changed tone, a pointed comment, a visible withdrawal, lands with the full weight of a verdict. And the person who receives it often responds not to the interpretation, but to the pressure the interpretation creates. The reply comes, the action follows, not because the facts justified speed, but because the cost of being misread was judged to be higher than the cost of absorbing the urgency. A pause is not abandonment. This distinction is simple to state and genuinely difficult to maintain under the emotional conditions described above, because the experience from the inside can feel identical to the accusation. When you choose to evaluate a request before responding, the anxiety of the other person intensifies. Their expressions of distress or disappointment land in real time. Nothing about the external situation confirms that you are being responsible rather than cold. The confirmation, if it comes, arrives later, in the quality of the response you ultimately deliver. In the moment, the pause carries its full cost without its eventual benefit. In message response contexts, the expectation of continuous availability has produced a particular form of this pressure. The read receipt, the last seen indicator, the visible ellipsis that means someone is typing. These tools have compressed the window between receipt and response to near zero, and their absence at a moment of another person's distress is treated as a communicative act. Not responding is now a response. Silence means something. Delay means something. The burden of that meaning is added to the pressure of the original request and to the fear of the interpretation that delay will generate. Three separate pressures arrive simultaneously before a single fact about the actual situation has been examined. The clearest antidote to this specific mechanism is the holding response, a brief, direct acknowledgement that does not commit to a timeline or a course of action, but confirms that the communication was received and will be addressed. Its function is to separate the question of whether you heard from the question of what you will do. "I have your message and I'll respond properly this evening" does not promise a particular answer. It removes the silence that generates the most alarming interpretations. It communicates presence without surrendering evaluation. What holding responses make possible is the examination of the request under something other than emergency pressure. They create a small interval between receipt and response, enough to ask the ownership questions, enough to assess the deadline, enough to determine what kind of situation this actually is. Whether the request turns out to warrant speed or measured response, the determination is now being made by someone who has looked at the facts. The holding response is not a stalling technique. It is the first act of reading the register. These emotional channels, anxiety, guilt, and the fear of misinterpretation, are the softer mechanisms by which urgency travels. Understanding how they work does not resolve the question of how to classify what arrives through them. For that, a more precise vocabulary is necessary. Chapter 3. 4 different clocks. The most frequently misclassified category is the one at the bottom of the scale. An inconvenience is a preference interrupted, a schedule disrupted, a plan complicated, a comfort delayed. The defining characteristic of an inconvenience is that the consequence of non-resolution is borne entirely by the person experiencing it, as a disappointment or a frustration, rather than as any meaningful harm. Nothing of real value is destroyed, no important window closes. A later solution resolves the situation as effectively as an immediate one, and in most cases more calmly. The language surrounding inconveniences often does not reflect their actual scale. This is a disaster. Everything is ruined. I need this fixed immediately. These phrases, delivered with full emotional weight, describe a scheduling conflict, a mislaid item, an administrative error, or a preference that cannot be accommodated at the preferred moment. The gap between the language and the reality is not always dishonesty. Many people genuinely experience inconveniences with the emotional intensity of serious problems, particularly if their daily experience offers them few reliable means of self-regulation, or if accumulated small frustrations have reached a threshold. The distress is real. Its proportion to the situation is another matter. Scheduling and administrative problems account for a large share of inconveniences presented with urgent language. The meeting that needs to be rescheduled, the form that cannot be located, the reply that did not arrive by the expected time, the arrangement that fell through at the last minute. Each of these produces genuine friction. None of them requires the reader of this register to move at crisis speed. The relevant question is not how much frustration the situation generates, but who bears the consequence of a measured response. When the primary consequence is the other person's continued frustration, the inconvenience belongs to them. The appropriate response is acknowledgement and practical assistance, not absorption of their timeline. Allowing an inconvenience to remain classified as an inconvenience, rather than accepting its presentation as a crisis, requires a tolerance for another person's discomfort that does not come easily to people who have built their reliability on resolving problems quickly. The reliable person has learned, through repeated experience, that moving immediately reduces friction in the room. The reduction of friction is immediate and visible. The cost of moving at an inaccurate speed is slower and harder to see. Across many such moments, the habit of upgrading inconveniences to crises in order to justify the speed already being demanded becomes automatic. Recognizing it is the beginning of resetting the classification. Important matters operate on a different set of terms entirely. Something is genuinely important when the consequence of handling it poorly or of not handling it at all is meaningful in a lasting way. Important things affect health, financial stability, significant relationships, major commitments, professional standing, or the welfare of people who depend on the decisions being made. The distinguishing feature is consequence, not immediacy. Most truly important matters are not simultaneously urgent. They have windows of weeks or months during which they can be addressed thoughtfully, and their proper handling usually benefits from that time rather than suffering because of it. The nature of importance is that it deserves care. Financial paperwork filed under pressure may produce errors that require correction for months. A medical appointment approached with adequate information and unhurried preparation tends to serve the patient better than one scheduled in a panic and attended without relevant history. A significant family decision made under a manufactured time constraint often carries long-term costs that the urgency that produced it never accounted for. What these situations share is a penalty for rushing, not because slow is better in the abstract, but because the depth of preparation, attention, and judgment that important matters require is exactly what speed tends to compromise. The confusion between important and urgent is one of the most common misclassifications this register encounters. Important matters that have been neglected begin to develop time sensitivity that they did not originally have. The health matter not attended to in its early manageable state becomes a genuine urgency when symptoms cannot be ignored. The financial paperwork not addressed during the months it was merely important becomes a real deadline when a legal window approaches. The family decision that no one was willing to have while the situation was stable becomes unavoidable when the situation deteriorates. In each case, the urgency is real when it arrives, but its arrival was not inevitable. It was the product of allowing importance to go unaddressed until time pressure created what deliberate attention might have prevented. Expertise deserves mention here because important matters frequently require it, and the recommendation to involve a qualified professional is itself sometimes delivered with urgency that distorts the decision. A financial advisor who says a window is closing, a physician who presents a treatment as needed without delay, an attorney who implies that action this week is legally necessary, each of these may be entirely correct. The expertise is real. The question is whether the urgency is a property of the situation or a property of the delivery. In genuine cases, an expert will be able to explain specifically what changes and when if the decision is delayed. That explanation is worth requesting. It is not skepticism. It is the appropriate use of the expertise being offered. Rushing through something genuinely important, treating it at inconvenient speed because the delivery pressure was high, produces a particular kind of damage that is invisible at the moment of decision and visible only in its aftermath. The decision made quickly, with incomplete information, under someone else's emotional pressure, rarely holds as well as it would have if the importance had been respected. The goal is not to avoid action on important matters. The goal is to act on them at the appropriate pace, which is almost never the pace at which they arrive. What distinguishes genuine urgency from importance is not the severity of the consequence, but the relationship between consequence and time. Urgency exists when a meaningful consequence is attached to a specific, genuine time window. The window is not invented. It is not a product of someone's emotional state or planning failure. There is an actual point at which a real cost incurs, and that point is near enough that prompt action changes the outcome in a way that later action would not. The deadline on a grant application, the final boarding call, the narrow window during which a response determines whether a deal proceeds. These are genuine urgencies because the window is external, verifiable, and consequential. An emergency is urgency at its highest degree of severity, where the consequence at stake is physical safety, serious harm, or irreversible loss that requires immediate action. Medical emergencies, safety threats, situations involving vulnerable people in acute distress, these belong in a category by themselves because they override the ownership audit entirely. When a genuine emergency is present, the first question is not who is responsible. The first question is what is needed right now, and who is best positioned to provide it, which often means professional emergency services, trained responders, or qualified medical personnel, rather than the person who happened to be available. Identifying who should act is as important as identifying that action is needed. The useful distinction in genuine emergencies is between what only a professional can do and what a bystander can do while professional help is being contacted. Attempting to take full medical, legal, or structural responsibility for situations that require credentialed competence is not heroism. It is overreach. And in acute situations, it can produce outcomes worse than the well-intentioned action intended to prevent. The contribution most adults can make in a true emergency is often stabilization, communication, and the rapid engagement of appropriate professional help. Knowing that limit is not cowardice. It is accuracy about capacity. False positives, situations experienced as emergencies that do not meet the objective standard, are common enough that they require acknowledgement without dismissiveness. A person who has experienced genuine crises in the past may activate emergency responses in situations that resemble earlier crises without meeting their threshold. A person who has been told repeatedly that they cannot manage difficulty may experience any significant disruption as catastrophic. These responses are real, and they produce real distress, and they deserve compassion rather than dismissal. But compassion towards someone experiencing a false positive is not best served by treating their emergency framing as accurate. It is best served by being calm, present, factually grounded, and genuinely useful, which requires the person offering help to maintain their own assessment of the situation even while acknowledging the other person's experience of it. The rule this register establishes is clear on one point. When genuine safety is at stake, the ownership questions wait. Debate about who created the situation, who should have planned differently, and who owns the consequence has its place, but that place is after the immediate safety concern has been addressed. A moral argument conducted while someone is in physical danger is not a demonstration of principle. It is a failure of priority. After the safety concern is resolved, the structural questions remain open and worth examining, because recurring crises rarely resolve themselves without the underlying patterns being addressed. Beyond inconvenience, importance, urgency, and emergency is a prior question. How did the reader of this register become such a reliable destination for other people's urgency in the first place? Chapter 4. Why your clock is easy to borrow. Competence attracts problems. This is not a complaint. It is a description of how systems, organizational, familial, social, distribute load. The person who reliably produces results, who follows through when others do not, who remembers what others forget and completes what others leave unfinished, becomes over time the natural destination for last-minute problems. The distribution is not usually a conspiracy. It is an emergent property of a system routing difficulty toward demonstrated capacity. The reliable person handles things. Therefore, things go to the reliable person. What begins as recognition becomes expectation, and what becomes expectation eventually shapes identity. At some point, the reliable person stops experiencing their availability as a choice and begins experiencing it as a characteristic, simply what they are. Others in the system absorb this understanding and act on it accordingly. The reliable person is factored into plans as a resource, not consulted as a person. Their time is incorporated into other people's timelines without explicit negotiation, because the pattern of past availability has established an informal permission that functions like a standing contract. The problem arrives because it always has. The distinction between being able to help and being permanently available to help is one that reliability makes extremely difficult to maintain. Ability is a capacity. Availability is a commitment. These two things are related but not identical. A surgeon's skill does not obligate them to operate at any hour for any patient without scheduling or preparation. A teacher's competence does not mean the classroom door is always open. In professional contexts, the boundary between capacity and availability is often formally structured. In informal contexts, the family, the friendship group, the workplace team, it tends to be governed entirely by precedent. And in systems where a reliable person has never declined, the precedent is unbroken availability. Workplace rescue scenarios make this dynamic particularly visible. The colleague who realizes at 4:30 that a deliverable needs to exist by 6 goes to the person who has always helped, not to the person who theoretically shares the responsibility. The senior team member who agreed to something they cannot produce goes to the person who can produce it, not to the conversation about what was actually agreed to. The project manager whose team is falling short goes to the reliable outside resource, not to the meeting where the shortfall is acknowledged. In each case, the routing is efficient from the perspective of the person doing the routing. The cost is borne by the person being routed to. There is a reward built into this pattern, and it matters that the reward is real. Being indispensable produces a particular satisfaction, the confirmation that your capacity is recognized, that your presence makes a material difference, that you are not merely a peripheral participant, but a load-bearing element of the systems you inhabit. This is not vanity. It reflects a genuine contribution, genuinely valued. The problem is not the reward. The problem is that the reward is available regardless of whether the request was legitimate, the urgency was real, or the cost to the reliable person's own priorities was proportionate to the contribution. Over time, the hidden cost becomes visible in particular forms. The reliable person's own meaningful commitments, the long-term projects that require sustained attention, the relationships that require unhurried presence, the health maintenance that requires consistent time, are the first things displaced when urgency arrives. They have no advocate. They make no calls. They produce no visible distress. They simply wait, and they wait for longer than they should, and they are attended to at whatever speed is left after everyone else's urgency has been managed. The compounding cost of this pattern is not dramatic. It accumulates quietly, in the gap between the life that was planned and the life that was available after the borrowed hours were distributed. Closely related to reliability, though distinct in its motivation, is the role of the fixer. The fixer's relationship to urgency is internal as much as external. Where the reliable person is sought out because of demonstrated competence, the fixer moves toward problems partly because unresolved problems produce a specific form of internal discomfort that resolution reliably eliminates. An open loop, a situation without a conclusion, a person in distress without an answer, a problem that has been named but not addressed, creates a particular tension in someone who has learned that competent action reliably closes loops. The fixing is not merely service, it is in part self-regulation. Understanding the mechanism does not reduce the value of what fixers contribute. Many genuine problems are resolved earlier and better because someone with this orientation noticed them and acted without waiting to be asked. The capacity for proactive problem solving is genuinely valuable in organizations, families, and friendships. What turns a capacity into a vulnerability is when the urgency of fixing belongs primarily to the fixer's need for resolution rather than to the situation being fixed. When the discomfort of watching a problem remain open is the primary driver of action, the question of whether this problem is mine to solve tends to arrive late, if at all. Helping and taking ownership look similar from the outside and feel similar from the inside, especially in the early stages. Helping means contributing to a resolution that the other person remains primarily responsible for. Taking ownership means absorbing the responsibility itself, the follow-through, the worry, the consequence, the ongoing monitoring. The transition between the two often occurs without a clear decision point. The fixer offers assistance, the other person accepts it. The fixer does more, the other person becomes a recipient, the fixer completes it, the other person is relieved. What began as helping has become substitution, and neither party necessarily made a deliberate choice at the moment when the shift occurred. In relationship and family contexts, this pattern tends to develop through accumulated small occasions rather than through one large decision. A partner who consistently resolves household crises finds that fewer crises are anticipated by the other partner because anticipation is no longer required. Resolution is available. A parent who solves every problem their adult child encounters finds that the child's problem-solving capacity is not developed through use. A friend who always knows what to do when another friend is stuck may find that the other friend stops developing their own capacity to navigate similar situations because the fixer is reliably present. The fixer did not intend any of these outcomes. They occurred as a consequence of a pattern of well-intentioned action, accumulated across enough time to establish a dependency. The moment worth examining is the one at which assistance becomes substitution, the specific decision point where the fixer crosses from contributing to taking over. It is usually preceded by one of several feelings: impatience with the pace of the other person's effort, anxiety about the quality of their approach, or the simple calculation that doing it entirely would be faster and cleaner than supporting their doing it partially. Each of these calculations may be factually accurate. None of them answers the ownership question. Whose responsibility is this? And does substituting for them serve their long-term capacity or merely resolve my short-term discomfort? There is a third role that attracts borrowed urgency through an entirely different mechanism. Not the drive to solve, but the drive to prevent conflict. When tension is visible in a room, the peacekeeper experiences it differently from the others present. Where some people can remain comfortable inside unresolved conflict, or even thrive in it, the peacekeeper experiences open tension as its own form of urgency. The friction between two people, the unaddressed grievance in a group, the silence that follows a difficult exchange, these register as problems requiring immediate management. The pressure to resolve them is felt in the body before any deliberate decision is made. Movement begins early, often before the facts of the conflict are clear. This is precisely the vulnerability. Moving before the facts are established means moving on the basis of the discomfort itself rather than the situation that generated it. The peacekeeper may step into a conflict that is actually in the process of resolving itself, interrupting a productive tension and substituting their own management for an outcome the parties would have reached independently. Or they may absorb the conflict's urgency from the party with the most distress, becoming an ally to whoever is most visibly upset, rather than whoever has the more accurate account, because urgency runs through distress faster than through calm. Family groups and workplace teams produce this dynamic with particular frequency. The parent who intervenes every time siblings argue prevents the siblings from developing conflict resolution between themselves. The team member who smooths over every workplace friction prevents the organization from addressing the underlying cause. The adult child who mediates every parental disagreement takes on a role their parents did not formally assign and may not actually welcome, while simultaneously absorbing a responsibility that belongs to the relationship they are managing. Each of these situations involves real care and real contribution. Each of them also involves the premature absorption of a situation whose proper conclusion might have required more discomfort and more time than the peacekeeper was willing to allow. Mediation and emotional absorption are different things. Mediation is a structured process of helping parties communicate through acknowledged ground rules, with the mediator preserving a defined neutrality and limited scope. Emotional absorption is the process by which the peacekeeper takes the conflict's tension into themselves, carries the distress of all parties simultaneously, and manages their own anxiety by resolving the situation, regardless of whether the resolution addresses the actual source of conflict or merely reduces the visible friction. The absorbed conflict does not disappear, it is compressed. And compressed conflict tends to re-emerge later, often in a more resistant form, because the original issue was never actually addressed. Short-term peace produced through emotional absorption creates a particular form of dependence that is rarely acknowledged. When the peacekeeper reliably intervenes, the parties in a conflict learn that sustained tension will be managed, that resolution will arrive without requiring them to engage directly with each other's concerns. The peacekeeper's availability becomes a structural feature of the group's conflict management system. Without it, the group may have developed its own capacity. With it, the group has outsourced that capacity to the peacekeeper, and over time, the outsourcing becomes load-bearing. Silence as a pressure tactic belongs in this discussion with a specific qualification. Not every strategic silence is deliberate. Some people withdraw as a genuine emotional response to conflict, without calculating the effect on a peacekeeper. Others use withdrawal strategically. Many people do both at different times, without full awareness of which is which. The peacekeeper, who reads every silence as a demand for immediate resolution, cannot easily distinguish between these. What is needed is the ability to let silence exist without filling it, to remain available without moving, long enough to determine whether the silence is a distress signal requiring response or a processing interval that deserves space. What each of these three roles shares is a pattern of absorbing urgency that arrives through the channel their particular orientation has left most open. The reliable person's channel is competence. The fixer's channel is the need for resolution. The peacekeeper's channel is the intolerance of tension. In each case, the incoming urgency finds a specific internal condition that accelerates the transfer. Recognizing which role is operating in a given moment is not the end of the analysis. It is the beginning of the ownership question, the formal examination the register was designed to record. Chapter 5. The ownership audit. The most useful entry in the borrowed hour register is the answer to one factual question. If nothing changes in the next 24 hours, who experiences the most significant consequence? This question does not ask who is most distressed, most vocal, most historically reliable, or most present in the room. It asks, specifically, who bears the actual outcome. The answer to that question is the beginning of an accurate ownership assignment. Consequence ownership frequently differs from delivery. The person who brings the urgency to you is not always the person who will experience the primary consequence of inaction. A colleague delivering an urgent request about someone else's project carries the urgency without carrying the consequence. A family member expressing distress about another family member's situation may be transmitting anxiety that originated elsewhere. The urgency arrived through the messenger. The consequence lives with someone further from the conversation. These are not always easy to separate, particularly when the messenger is genuinely invested in the outcome. But the separation matters because it clarifies what your involvement actually produces and for whom. Decision authority is the second question. Who has the actual standing to make the call that resolves this situation? In organizations, decision authority follows formal structure most of the time, though informal authority can diverge from it in complex ways. In families, decision authority is often contested or unclear, particularly around health, finances, and living arrangements that involve adults of different generations. Identifying who actually holds decision authority helps locate the ownership more precisely. If you do not hold decision authority over an outcome and are not directly designated to act on behalf of someone who does, your role in that situation is advisory or supportive, not primary. Who holds relevant information is the third factor. Ownership often follows knowledge. The person who has been living with a situation, who knows its history, who has access to the relevant parties and the detailed context, generally has both more responsibility for and more capacity to address it than the person who has just been informed of its existence. When urgency arrives at your door accompanied by a compressed briefing that leaves most of the important context out, the information deficit is itself significant. A response built on incomplete information is likely to be a poor response regardless of its speed. The information question also surfaces a relevant observation. If you need to be briefed on the context before acting, the situation is probably not yours in the primary sense. Whether you have a defined duty, a formal, contractual, relational, or clearly established obligation is the fourth dimension of ownership. Duties are real and they belong in the register. A parent's duty to a minor child, a professional's duty within a defined scope of practice, an employee's duty to fulfill an explicit job requirement, a partner's commitment within a relationship, these create genuine responsibilities that the ownership audit must acknowledge. The audit is not designed to dissolve duties. It is designed to distinguish duties from absorbed expectations that were never formally established. Support is different from ownership. Offering to assist someone in managing their responsibility, providing information, completing a defined portion of a larger task, making a connection to a resource they need, is support. It preserves the other person's ownership while contributing to the outcome. Taking the whole problem on, managing the follow-through, monitoring the result, experiencing the worry of a responsibility that was never formally assigned, is not support. It is substitution, and it does not benefit either party in the way that keeping the ownership correctly assigned does. The register asks you to make the distinction explicit before committing. Before any decision about how to respond, the register asks one prior question about the deadline itself. When did this situation first become known? The answer to this question does not change what must happen now. It does clarify what is being asked of you and why the request has arrived at this moment rather than at an earlier one. That clarity is not punitive. It is logistical because it determines whether you are being asked to contribute to a genuinely emergent situation or to compensate for an avoidable compression. Why the urgency reached you now, rather than a week ago, or yesterday, or at the beginning of the quarter, is the follow-up question. Sometimes the answer is straightforward. A genuine development occurred late, an expected resource became unavailable, a situation changed in ways that no one anticipated. These are legitimate late arrivals. Treat them accordingly. More often the answer is that the problem was visible earlier and was not addressed. The reasons vary widely: competing priorities, difficulty initiating difficult conversations, optimism about available time, or the simple calculation that the problem might resolve itself before it required action. None of these reasons makes the urgency false. All of them make it relevant to know. Avoidable compression is the term for a deadline that was shortened by choices the requester made before reaching you. Identifying it does not mean refusing to help. It means understanding what you are actually absorbing. When you move at emergency speed to address something that was available at planning speed for weeks before it arrived, you are providing a service whose primary beneficiary is the person whose planning failure produced the compression. That may still be worth providing. There are relationships and contexts where it is entirely appropriate to absorb that cost. The question is whether you are making that choice deliberately or whether you absorbed it because the urgency was presented in a way that made the origin invisible. Legitimate late developments deserve a different kind of attention. When something genuinely emerges on short notice, a scheduled resource cancels, a regulatory change arrives unexpectedly, a party to an agreement changes their position without warning. The urgency belongs to the situation rather than to someone's planning gap. Distinguishing this from avoidable compression matters because it changes both your response and your posture. Genuine late developments warrant more unguarded engagement. Avoidable compressions warrant engagement with a clearer boundary on scope. Whether the deadline can actually move is worth examining, particularly for deadlines presented as fixed. Many deadlines that arrive as immovable are, in practice, the product of a preference or an initial commitment that has not been renegotiated. A client who was told delivery would occur by Friday is operating from a communication that could, in principle, be updated. A family plan established without explicit confirmation of each party's availability is an expectation rather than a contract. An internal organizational deadline set by informal consensus rather than legal requirement may accommodate a conversation in a way that no one has yet attempted to have. Not all deadlines can move, but before accepting that one cannot, it is worth asking whether anyone has yet tried. What it costs to refuse the compression is the honest final question. Refusing to absorb someone else's planning failure has consequences, and those consequences are real and worth acknowledging. A professional relationship may cool. A family dynamic may become temporarily strained. A reputation for a particular kind of availability may be revised. These costs exist. The register does not pretend otherwise. What it asks is that these costs be evaluated in the same factual frame as the costs of accepting, rather than being absorbed automatically, because refusal produces immediate discomfort, while acceptance produces immediate relief. The factual reply that emerges from this examination is not an argument. It is an accurate statement of what you can contribute on what timeline and under what conditions. It is delivered once calmly, without extended justification. What it says in essence is, here is what I understand about the situation, here is what I can reasonably do, and here is when I can do it. The requester can work with that, or return to the conversation. Both of those outcomes are more productive than a commitment made under pressure that will not hold. Every urgent yes is a displacement. This is not a rhetorical claim. It is a practical one. Your time and attention are finite, and whatever occupies them at the moment of an urgent request is released, delayed, or abandoned when the urgent request is accepted. The question the register asks about displacement is not whether it occurs, but whether the trade being made is a deliberate choice or an invisible one. Making the displacement explicit begins with naming what is currently in the space the request would occupy. Not abstractly, not my priorities, but specifically the report that needs 2 hours of sustained attention, the conversation that has been deferred twice already, the physical appointment that was difficult to schedule, the committed period with a person who matters. These things do not announce their displacement. They simply wait, and the length of their waiting is determined by how many urgent requests arrive and how many of them are absorbed without examination. Among the invisible costs of urgent yes responses, sleep is one of the least visible and most consequential. The urgent task accepted at the end of a day extends into a night that was supposed to provide recovery. The problem delivered at 6:30 that just needs a quick look frequently requires more than a quick look. Judgment is quietly degraded by the time the task is complete, and the judgment that was degraded was the very instrument needed to evaluate the next incoming urgency. Sleep displaced by borrowed urgency does not announce what it cost. The cost appears later, in reduced capacity, in shorter tolerance, in decisions made with less of the attention they deserved. Planned work, the kind of work whose value is long-term and whose progress is invisible in the short term, is the most consistently displaced category because it never calls. A research project, a professional development effort, a creative undertaking, a relationship conversation that would require unhurried time, none of these will vibrate at a moment of distress. None of them will send a follow-up. They hold their place in the plan silently and release it silently when something urgent arrives. Over a month of accumulated urgent yeses, the displacement of planned work is substantial. Over a year, it can determine the shape of an entire professional or personal trajectory. The question of who chose the trade is worth sitting with. In most cases, no trade was formally chosen. The urgent request arrived, the response followed, the displaced thing moved to later. Later never came. The displaced thing was not sacrificed through a deliberate decision that this is worth that. It was displaced by a sequence of accommodations, each of which felt reasonable at the moment and whose cumulative cost was never calculated. The register creates the occasion for that calculation by naming both sides of the trade before it is made. When an urgent request arrives against a genuinely important commitment, a meeting with a specialist, a legal deadline, a scheduled conversation with a child, a professional obligation with external consequence, the collision creates a genuine competing priority rather than a simple displacement. These situations require actual decision-making. Which of these carries the larger genuine consequence, and who bears that consequence. Genuine exceptions exist. There are moments where the incoming urgency clearly outweighs the prior commitment. But exceptions distinguished through factual examination are different from the habitual displacement of important commitments by louder urgency. The loudness of the request is not evidence of its comparative importance. What constitutes a genuine exception is worth defining clearly. A safety concern outranks a professional commitment. A medical urgency outranks a social obligation. A situation involving genuine dependence in immediate need outranks a planned personal activity. Outside these categories, exceptions should be examined case by case rather than granted reflexively. The willingness to examine a claimed exception rather than honor it automatically is one of the core capacities the register is designed to develop. And the development of that capacity brings into view the practical question of how to actually return the borrowed urgency to its proper owner. Chapter 6. Returning the clock. The first skill in returning urgency is learning to pause without disappearing. These are not the same action, and their difference matters. Disappearing means becoming unavailable, unreachable, silent in a way that creates its own alarm. Pausing means being present and communicative, while declining to move at the speed being requested. The holding response is the practical mechanism for doing exactly that, for occupying the interval between receiving the urgency and evaluating the request in a way that the other person can recognize and work with. Acknowledging receipt is the first component. The other person needs to know quickly that their message arrived. The anxiety produced by genuine silence, the uncertainty about whether communication was received at all, is a separate and legitimate concern from the urgency of the request itself. A brief confirmation eliminates that specific concern without committing to any course of action. It does not say yes, it does not say no. It says, "I have this, and I will be back to you." What a holding response states, in addition to confirmation of receipt, is a specific window for the actual reply. Not soon, not when I can, but a named interval. This evening, tomorrow morning, by noon on Friday. Specificity serves two purposes. For the other person, it creates a defined waiting period that is manageable rather than open-ended. For you, it creates a committed window for genuine evaluation, a protected interval during which the ownership questions can be examined without the additional pressure of an unanswered message. The specificity is not a promise of a particular answer. It is a promise of a deliberate one. Premature agreement is one of the primary failure modes in high-pressure situations, and the holding response is specifically designed to prevent it. "I'll handle it," uttered under surge conditions, before the facts are known, before the ownership questions are examined, before the displacement costs are calculated, is not a commitment. It is a pressure response masquerading as a decision. The difference becomes apparent when the facts eventually arrive, and the commitment made in the surge turns out to be inappropriate, disproportionate, or practically impossible to fulfill as stated. Walking back that kind of commitment carries a social cost that the premature agreement was supposed to prevent. The cost simply moved forward in time. The language of holding responses for adult contexts tends toward the concise. Brevity is not coldness. In many professional and relational situations, a short and clear holding response communicates more confidence and respect than a long explanation of why evaluation is needed. "I have your message, I'll come back to you with a clear answer by tomorrow morning," does not require justification. It is a complete response to the fact of the communication. The explanation of what the evaluation involves and the reasoning behind the timeline can be offered when the full response is delivered, if it is relevant at all. Clarity, not elaborate justification, is what makes a holding response effective. The impulse to over-explain, to preemptively defend the delay against imagined objections, tends to undermine the response it was meant to support. An extended explanation of why you need time to think invites the other person to argue with the explanation. A simple statement that the full response will arrive at a specific time does not. One of the most useful applications of the holding response is in situations where the pressure to agree immediately is highest, which is precisely where the evaluation interval is most needed, and where premature agreement produces its most significant costs. Once the holding response has created an interval for evaluation, the next step is to examine the situation with a specific set of questions. These are not adversarial. They are not designed to challenge or undermine the person making the request. They are factual inquiries that clarify the nature of the situation, the ownership of the consequence, and the genuine role, if any, that your involvement plays. What they accomplish is the replacement of emotional acceleration with accurate information. The first question is simply, what happens if this waits? Not rhetorically, but specifically. If the response to this request arrives in 3 hours rather than 3 minutes or tomorrow morning rather than tonight, what concrete consequence occurs? This question exposes the actual stakes. A situation where the answer is, the client will have to wait until tomorrow and may be mildly inconvenient, is categorically different from one where a regulatory window closes and a significant obligation cannot be met. The honest answer to this question places the urgency inside a factual frame for the first time. Who else could act on this, if not you, is the second question. In situations where the urgency is genuine, but the ownership does not belong to you, there is often another person, institution or resource that is more properly positioned to address it. The automatic routing of a problem toward the reliable person, the fixer or the peacekeeper, frequently bypasses alternatives that were not explored because your availability was assumed. Asking whether another capable party exists, a colleague with the relevant authority, a professional with the relevant expertise, a family member with more direct knowledge of the situation, is not evasion. It is an accurate inventory of who the appropriate actor actually is. What has already been attempted is the third question, and it is one of the most useful because it simultaneously establishes the context and identifies what portion of the work, if any, belongs to you. A situation presented as entirely unaddressed is different from one where multiple approaches have been tried and failed. In the former, your contribution would need to begin from the starting conditions. In the latter, you are being asked to enter a situation with a history that shapes what remains possible. Understanding what has already been attempted also clarifies whether the urgency is a product of the current circumstances or of a pattern of previous decisions that have already shaped the available options. Which specific part of this requires you, not your category of competence, but the particular thing that only your involvement makes possible, is the fourth question. The distinction matters because urgency tends to arrive as an undifferentiated whole, and the instinct of reliable people, fixers and peacekeepers alike, is to absorb the whole. In many cases, only a specific portion of the situation actually requires their particular involvement. The rest is work that someone else could do, or that the owner could do, or that does not need to be done at the speed being requested. Identifying the precise slice that genuinely requires your involvement clarifies both your contribution and your appropriate limit. Whether the deadline is externally fixed, in the sense discussed in the deadline section, or whether it is a product of expectation, precedent, or preference, is the fifth question. Deadlines deserve examination rather than automatic acceptance. Many will turn out to be genuinely fixed, some will not. For those that are not, asking the question creates the possibility of a conversation that did not exist before the question was raised. As the answers to these questions arrive, the emotional acceleration that delivered the urgency typically reduces. Facts are calming in this particular way, not because they always produce comfortable answers, but because they replace a diffuse pressure with a defined situation that can be engaged with directly. The person who was transmitting urgency may find that their own anxiety reduces once someone begins asking precise questions about the situation, because the questions signal engagement and competence rather than indifference. There are answers that reveal a genuine emergency, where what happens if this waits turns out to be safety critical, where no one else can act, where the deadline is verifiably fixed and immovable, where the specific requirement is something only you can provide. When those answers arrive, the evaluation is complete and the emergency protocol applies. The questions do not delay response in a true emergency. They identify it. The distinction between an urgent situation that requires your immediate engagement and one that was delivered at emergency speed without meeting the emergency standard, is exactly what the questions are designed to produce. Once the ownership questions are resolved and the factual picture is clear, a specific form of assistance becomes available, one that offers genuine support without absorbing the ownership that belongs elsewhere. The defining characteristic of this assistance is that it has an explicit scope. It is not open-ended engagement with the full situation. It is a defined contribution to a portion of the situation, with the remainder staying in the hands of the person who owns the consequence. Defining the portion that stays with the owner is as important as defining what you will contribute. I can review the draft and give you feedback by Thursday, but the submission process and the deadline tracking are yours is complete and clear. It does not require negotiation. It states specifically what is on offer and what is not. The clarity serves both parties. The other person knows exactly what to expect and can plan around it. You have defined a limit that you can actually honor rather than a commitment that will expand under pressure. Setting timing and scope together produces a contribution that is both generous and sustainable. Timing establishes when the help is available, not continuously, not at any hour, but within a named window. Scope establishes what the help includes, not the whole problem, but a specific portion. These two constraints together constitute an offer rather than a surrender. They communicate care and competence while preserving the ownership structure that the audit identified. In caregiving contexts, the application of this principle often requires particular care because the emotional stakes are high and the sense of duty is strong. Providing emotional support to a parent navigating a medical situation, being present, asking questions, helping communicate with providers, is different from managing the entire situation on the parent's behalf. The former sustains relationship and well-being on both sides. The latter, sustained over time, can reduce the parent's own agency and competence while increasing yours beyond what either party formally agreed to. In workplace situations, offering to complete a defined deliverable for a struggling colleague is different from taking ownership of the colleague's entire workload, their relationship with the client, and the consequences of whatever preceded the moment they asked for help. Overfunctioning has a specific long-term effect on the systems it occurs within. It trains future transfer. When a person reliably absorbs more than their portion, the people around them learn that overextension produces results, that they do not need to develop the capacity, the planning, or the discipline that would have been required if the absorption had not been available. This is not a moral condemnation. It is a systemic observation. The person who overfunctions is usually motivated by care and competence. The training effect is a consequence, not an intention. But recognizing it is important because it means that learning to offer bounded assistance rather than total absorption is an act of long-term care rather than a reduction of it. Disappointment is a reasonable response to a boundary. When someone expected a particular form of help and receives a more limited offer, they may express frustration, hurt, or withdrawal. Preparing for this reaction does not mean preemptively offering more to avoid it. It means having decided in advance that the disappointment is a consequence you can bear. Because the alternative, absorbing ownership indefinitely to prevent discomfort in the other person, produces a larger and more durable cost. The disappointment usually passes. The overfunctioning pattern, once established, tends not to. Here, the register offers an invitation to its reader. Before moving forward, it is worth pausing to identify the single most consistent source of borrowed urgency in your own life, the person, relationship, or situation that most reliably sends urgency your way. This reflection is private. It does not require a public declaration or a confrontation. It requires only honesty about what you already know. The identification does not need to be followed immediately by action. Simply naming the source accurately, to yourself in whatever private space you use for honest thinking, is the beginning of bringing it into a factual frame. Recognizing that you can care deeply for someone without inheriting their emergency is one of the most demanding distinctions this register develops. The care is not diminished by the limit. The help is not less genuine because it has a scope. What changes is that the help is now sustainable. that the person offering it has retained enough of their own time, energy, and judgment to offer it again the next time it is genuinely needed, rather than having distributed all of those resources in one compressed and inherited crisis. And that sustainability matters most in the situations this register has not yet addressed, the ones where the urgency is real. Chapter 7. When the emergency is real. There are situations in which the ownership question should not be the first thing asked. When immediate physical danger is present, when someone is injured, when a medical event is unfolding, when a person is in acute crisis that places them or others at risk, the appropriate sequence is not deliberation. It is action directed at safety, and then engagement of the professional resources equipped to manage the situation properly. The borrowed hour register was not designed to introduce hesitation into genuine emergencies. It was designed to prevent non-emergencies from functioning as emergencies. These are different problems with different remedies. Contacting emergency services and qualified help is not a secondary option to be reached after personal efforts prove insufficient. In situations involving immediate physical danger, medical events, or acute psychological crisis, professional response is the appropriate first option. The reason for this prioritization is not formality, but competence. Emergency medical, safety, and crisis professionals have training, equipment, and protocols that most bystanders do not. The fastest and most useful thing a non-specialist can usually do in a genuine emergency is ensure that the right professionals are contacted and then remain present and calm until they arrive. The impulse to debate the situation, to raise the ownership questions, to examine who created the crisis, to hold the structural conversation before acting, is precisely what safety requires setting aside. The structural conversation has its place, and it is not at the moment when someone is in immediate danger. Whatever failures of planning, communication, or preparation contributed to the emergency, they remain available for examination after the immediate situation is resolved. Nothing about that conversation is lost by delaying it. It does not become less true. But an injury that could have been addressed sooner does not wait for structural clarity. A restrained illustration. Consider the family member who calls and clearly cannot manage a situation that is beyond their capacity, not because of any particular character failing, but because the situation itself exceeds what a non-specialist should be expected to handle. The ownership questions do not need to be answered before the call to the appropriate service is made. The structural questions about what led to this moment, about how the preparation failed, and what systemic change is needed, these belong to the conversation that follows. The immediate action belongs to the immediate moment. Personal limits within an emergency context deserve acknowledgement. Being present, calm, and communicative while professional help is engaged is a real and important contribution. Attempting to provide medical care beyond one's actual training, to manage a structural or legal emergency through personal action, or to contain a situation that requires professional intervention. These responses emerge from genuine care and genuine urgency, and they can cause harm that the original emergency did not. Knowing what you can actually do and doing that clearly is more useful than attempting everything and managing the consequences of overreach on top of the original emergency. Heroic overreach, the impulse to be the one who resolves the emergency entirely, through personal effort, without professional involvement, tends to appear in people who have built strong identities around reliable problem-solving. In a genuine emergency, the most important thing may be the thing you cannot do. Naming that clearly and directing the situation toward who can is an act of genuine competence, rather than a failure of it. After immediate safety is secured, a specific kind of attention becomes appropriate. What happened, what was done, whether the response was adequate, what professional follow-up is needed, and what structural or relational considerations were exposed by the emergency. These questions belong to the period that follows the acute event. Allowing time for that follow-up, rather than treating the emergency as concluded once the immediate moment passes, is part of responsible engagement with the situation. It is also where the conversation about recurring patterns, if they exist, can begin. A system that generates genuine crises repeatedly requires a different analysis from a system that experienced a genuine one-time emergency. When the same person, family, or organization produces urgent situations with regularity, when the pattern of crisis, absorption, resolution, and reset repeats reliably across months or years, what is being observed is not a series of independent emergencies. It is a structural problem that has not been addressed, presenting itself episodically in the form of acute need. Separating acute help from structural repair is one of the most important distinctions in the register, and one of the most consistently neglected. Each acute episode genuinely requires attention. The structural problem that keeps generating acute episodes requires a different kind of attention. Planning, professional support, organizational change, capacity development, or some combination of these. Providing acute help repeatedly without addressing the structural cause is the equivalent of repeatedly stopping a leak with your hand while the pipe remains broken. The leak is real. The hand is necessary in the moment, but it does not fix the pipe. Identifying patterns of poor planning or unsupported dependence is not a judgment about character. It is a diagnostic observation about a system that is not operating in a way that can sustain itself. A family member whose repeated crises follow the same arc, the same avoidance, the same accumulation, the same escalation to urgency, is not necessarily choosing that pattern deliberately. They may lack the skills, the support, or the awareness to interrupt it on their own. Understanding this helps clarify what kind of assistance would actually help them. Not another absorbed crisis, but access to the structural support that the pattern indicates is missing. Workplace examples are instructive. A team that regularly enters the final week of a project in crisis mode is not experiencing bad luck. It is experiencing the consequence of a planning process that does not account for realistic contingencies, a communication culture that delays the surfacing of problems, or a resource allocation that leaves insufficient margin. Each individual crisis may be genuine. The pattern is structural. The reliable person who absorbs each crisis without naming the pattern is providing a service that prevents the pattern from becoming visible enough to be addressed. A post-crisis review is the appropriate tool for beginning to address recurring patterns. After the acute event is resolved and some time has passed, a factual examination of what happened when each element became visible and what different choices at each point would have changed, the outcome creates the material for structural improvement. This examination does not require blame. It requires honesty about the sequence of decisions that produced the outcome. Without it, the next episode is likely to follow the same arc, and the person absorbing the crisis will be in the same position with slightly less of the energy, patience, and goodwill that sustainable help requires. Setting preventive responsibilities, specific, named responsibilities assigned to specific people before the next crisis emerges, is the practical outcome of the post-crisis review. Not aspirational goals, but concrete actions with owners and timelines. Who will schedule the appointment before it becomes critical? Who will review the project status at the midpoint? Who will communicate the limitation before the deadline rather than after it? These assignments exist because the review identified that their absence was part of what produced the emergency. Assigning them without follow-up is insufficient. Following up on them is the difference between a post-crisis review that changes the pattern and one that merely creates the appearance of having done so. What genuine compassion looks like in the context of recurring crises is not permanent rescue. Permanent rescue maintains the system that keeps producing the crises. Genuine compassion looks more like presence, structural support, professional referral, and the willingness to let the natural consequences of unaddressed patterns teach the ownership that a history of absorption could not. Another person's distress is real, and it deserves to be received as real. Validating what someone is experiencing, acknowledging that their situation is genuinely hard, that their anxiety is understandable, that the difficulty they face is not imagined, is not a concession to their urgency timeline. It is an accurate response to a real human experience. These two things are separable, the acknowledgement and the timetable. Receiving someone's distress fully does not require absorbing their emergency entirely. Empathy is not total mobilization. This distinction is one that the emotional logic of urgent situations tends to collapse, because in moments of high distress, the withdrawal of total engagement can feel, from the other person's perspective, like a withdrawal of care. The internal experience of the person setting the limit does not always match the external perception of it. Understanding this gap and preparing for it rather than being destabilized by it is part of what sustainable compassion requires. The practical alternatives to total mobilization are genuine contributions rather than evasions. Presence, staying in the situation without taking it over, is itself valuable. Providing accurate information that helps the person understand their options is valuable. Completing a specific bounded action that directly addresses one element of the situation while leaving the remainder with the owner is valuable. None of these is less caring than total absorption. Each of them preserves something that total absorption destroys: the other person's agency in their own situation and your own capacity to help again. Permanent readiness, remaining continuously available to mobilize for someone's distress, regardless of the factual classification of the situation, damages judgment over time. The person in a state of permanent readiness has calibrated their responses to manage the distress of the other person rather than to assess the actual situation. Over months, this calibration becomes the dominant instrument. The owned emergencies are processed at the same level as the borrowed ones. The loud situations receive the same response as the severe ones. The distinction between genuine emergency and transmitted anxiety becomes less accessible because the readiness itself has replaced the evaluation. Sustainable help requires limits because it operates within a finite supply of time, attention, and emotional capacity. This is not a personal failing. It is a practical reality that applies to everyone, including the people most naturally inclined toward care and contribution. A doctor who attempts to be available to every patient at all times is, over time, less useful to any specific patient than one who operates within defined and sustainable practice boundaries. A parent who never rests cannot sustain the quality of presence their child needs over years rather than hours. The limit is not a reduction of care. It is a condition of care's continuity. Professional support deserves explicit mention here because many recurring situations of genuine distress exceed what personal care, however well-intentioned, can actually address. A family member whose crises consistently involve mental health, addiction, financial instability, or medical complexity is experiencing something that care alone cannot repair. Connecting them with qualified professional support, gently, specifically, and without abandoning the relationship, is among the most genuinely helpful things that can be offered. It is not a referral delivered as a rejection. It is the honest acknowledgement that the situation requires more capacity and specialization than personal care alone provides. Stepping back from a pattern of unlimited absorption produces guilt in many people, even when the decision is carefully considered and the remaining help is genuine and appropriate. The guilt does not necessarily indicate that the decision was wrong. It may simply indicate that the role being released was one that carried significant meaning, that the person needing help is genuinely distressed by the change, or that a long-established pattern is being interrupted for the first time. Guilt deserves examination. It may be pointing at something real, but it is not automatically accurate. Feeling guilty for setting a limit does not mean the limit was a moral error. In genuine emergencies, duty is real, and it remains present. What the register asks of its reader is not the abandonment of duty, but its accurate identification. The ability to distinguish between a duty that exists and a duty that was never formally established, but arrived through accumulated expectation. The genuine duty is honored. The absorbed expectation is returned to its owner, and the capacity that returns when borrowed obligations are released becomes available for what is genuinely required, including the building of an internal clock that belongs to the person it keeps time for. Chapter 8. The Internal Clock. Before any urgency arrives today, some things already exist in your life that you chose, committed to, or began before the interruption. A piece of work, that requires sustained concentration to advance. A relationship that has been waiting for the kind of unhurried attention that quick exchanges cannot provide. A health practice, a creative project, a professional undertaking whose progress is measured not in the speed of a single session, but across weeks of consistent effort. These are not wishes. They are actual commitments whose execution defines the shape of your life across months and years rather than hours. The loudness of a request is not correlated with its importance. The request that arrives with the most intensity, at the highest velocity, with the most visible distress, does not carry objective priority over the quiet thing you had already committed to doing. The silence of your existing commitments, the fact that they make no calls, send no messages, produce no visible anxiety in the room, does not indicate that they are lower in actual priority. It indicates only that they have no voice. They cannot advocate for themselves in real time. The advocacy has to be provided by the person who chose them. Protecting meaningful work that is not urgent requires a specific kind of deliberateness, because the conditions under which such work is interrupted are almost never dramatic. The interruption arrives as reasonable sounding, a quick question, a brief delay, a short contribution to something that matters to someone else. Each interruption, taken individually, seems manageable. Their cumulative effect on the sustained work is significant. A piece of writing, a professional development effort, a project that requires thinking across multiple days. These require protection, not because they are more important than everything else, but because they are uniquely vulnerable to exactly the kind of accumulation of small interruptions that borrowed urgency delivers. Family commitments, health maintenance and creative pursuits share a quality that makes them especially susceptible to displacement. Their consequences of neglect are long cycle rather than immediate. A skipped medical appointment does not produce a crisis today. A missed creative session does not produce visible damage this week. A deferred family conversation does not become a rupture this month. The harm accumulates on a timeline that makes it invisible in the short term and significant in the long term. This slow accumulation is precisely why these commitments need review windows, deliberately scheduled moments to examine whether they have been honored or displaced, not as punishment, but as recalibration. Establishing review windows means designating specific, recurring intervals to examine whether your actual priorities are receiving the time and attention they require. Weekly is a practical interval for most people. The examination is simple. What was planned for this week? What happened? Where was the displacement? And what adjustment is needed? This is not a performance review. It is navigation, the periodic comparison between intended course and actual course, with correction as needed. A response cadence is simply a defined pattern for when and how incoming requests receive attention. Without a deliberate cadence, the pattern defaults to continuous reactivity. Every incoming communication receives attention at the moment of arrival, and the priority structure of the day is determined by whoever communicates most recently and most urgently. A deliberate cadence reverses this. Defined windows for reviewing and responding to requests, with the space between those windows available for the kind of sustained work and present attention that reactive availability prevents. Creating response windows does not require elaborate systems. It requires, most fundamentally, the decision that certain hours are for engagement with incoming requests and others are for sustained existing commitments. The specific structure varies by professional and personal context. A professional in a client-facing role has different constraints from one whose work is primarily internal. A parent with young children has different needs from an adult whose domestic responsibilities are more flexible. The principle is consistent. Defined windows, communicated clearly, maintained with reasonable consistency. Defining an emergency channel is the element that makes a response cadence responsible rather than merely protective. An emergency channel is the specific means by which genuine urgency that cannot wait for a scheduled window can reach you. It is narrow and clearly communicated, a specific phone number rather than a general inbox, a named person who can escalate, a defined category of situation that triggers an immediate response. Its narrowness is not coldness. It is what makes everything outside it genuinely available for the defined windows, rather than the perpetual background anxiety of potentially missing something urgent. Communicating expectations is the step that transforms a personal decision into a workable system. The people who regularly communicate with you need to know in practical terms when to expect responses and how to reach you when something genuinely cannot wait. This communication does not require extensive explanation. A simple statement of normal response windows and an emergency contact method gives other people the information they need to interact with you sustainably. It also shifts the burden of urgency management. The other person can now assess whether their situation warrants the emergency channel or can wait for the regular window, rather than that assessment being left entirely to reactive judgment. Flexibility within a cadence is not a concession, it is a feature. A response cadence is not a rigid schedule that excludes all deviation. It is a default pattern that protects sustained work and existing commitments while allowing deliberate exceptions when genuine situations warrant them. The distinction between a deliberate exception and a habit of breaking the cadence is made through the ownership audit. Is this situation actually urgent? Does it actually require me? And is the displacement it produces worth the trade? Sometimes the answer is yes. When it is yes through examination rather than reflex, the exception is chosen rather than absorbed. Reviewing whether the cadence works is part of operating it. A response pattern that consistently fails to protect the things it was designed to protect is not working regardless of how carefully it was designed. A pattern that others consistently override, whose emergency channel is used for non-emergencies, whose defined windows are routinely ignored by people who communicate continuously throughout the day, requires either adjustment or the more direct conversation about expectations that the current pattern has not yet had. The cadence is a tool. Its value is in the results it produces, not in its existence as a system. After a boundary is clearly communicated, the other person may remain anxious. They may continue to operate at their previous speed, sending messages before the defined window, expressing frustration at the response time, interpreting the cadence as distance or indifference. This reaction is real. It does not by itself indicate that the boundary was wrong. What it indicates is that the other person's internal state has not yet adjusted to the new structure, and that adjustment is theirs to make, not yours to prevent by abandoning the structure. Using compliance to regulate another person's anxiety is a reliable way to keep them from developing the tolerance for a boundary that the boundary requires. When anxiety rises and the boundary is released to reduce it, the lesson delivered is that the anxiety will work, that sufficient distress produces the compliance that removes the discomfort. This lesson travels in both directions. The anxious person learns that sustained distress eventually opens the boundary. You learn that the boundary cannot be held when the other person is sufficiently uncomfortable. Neither lesson serves either party. The distinction between cruelty and non-absorption is simple to state but requires steady navigation under pressure. Cruelty is indifference to another person's real need, refusing to engage with what genuinely matters, withdrawing presence for reasons that have nothing to do with capacity or appropriate limits. Non-absorption is the maintenance of accurate ownership, continuing to be available within defined parameters for what actually belongs in that space, while declining to absorb the urgency that does not. From the inside, these can feel similar in moments of high distress. From the outside, they look different when observed over time. Consider a manager who operates at high velocity and expects continuous responsiveness from their team. When a team member introduces a defined response window, communicates normal hours and a means of escalation, the manager's initial reaction may be exactly the kind of pressure that the window was designed to address. More frequent messages, expressed frustration, implicit suggestions that the delay constitutes a performance problem. The team member who holds the window calmly and responds within it consistently, who activates the escalation path for genuine urgencies and uses it proportionately, is not being resistant. They are providing the manager with information about what sustainable responsiveness from their role actually looks like. That information is useful even when its initial reception is friction. Allowing consequences to teach ownership has a specific meaning here. When a problem that was previously absorbed by the available, reliable person is no longer absorbed, That problem remains with the person who owns the consequence. If the planning failure that produced the compression is not rescued this time, the discomfort of the outcome lands where it originates. That discomfort, experienced directly, carries information that absorbed rescue conceals. It communicates that the planning failure had a cost, and that the cost is available to be redesigned. This is not punishment delivered by the boundary setter. It is the natural result of accurate ownership assignment. The reliable person did not manufacture the consequence. They simply declined to absorb it. Remaining available within defined limits is the specific form of continued care that this section asks of its reader. Not unavailability, not permanent refusal, but a defined, communicable, consistently maintained range of genuine engagement within appropriate parameters. This availability is actually more valuable than the unlimited but exhausted availability that preceded it, because it operates from a state of genuine capacity rather than the depleted obligation of a person who has been borrowed to zero. Noticing the internal clock begin to slow, the physical experience of returning to a tempo that belongs to your own judgment rather than someone else's urgency, is one of the recognizable signs that the register is working. The shoulders drop slightly. The next sentence comes without the pressure of an unanswered message behind it. The thought is completed. The conversation at the table continues. The afternoon has the shape you gave it, rather than the shape that arrived uninvited. That tempo is not selfishness. It is the condition under which good decisions, genuine presence, and sustainable care become possible. Final chapter. The borrowed hour protocol. The protocol begins with a physical observation rather than a decision. Notice that your internal tempo has accelerated, that something in the presentation of the incoming request has moved your attention faster than your own judgment has authorized. The noticing itself is the first step. Before any response, before any evaluation, the simple recognition that acceleration has occurred separates the beginning of borrowed urgency from its usual transparent acceptance. You are moving at someone else's speed. That fact is now visible. The specific failure mode that the protocol targets next is agreement during the first emotional surge. The surge is the moment at which the urgency is transmitted most efficiently, when the distress is most visible, the delivery is most intense, and the social pressure to respond is highest. Commitments made in that window are made under conditions that reduce the accuracy of evaluation. The protocol asks that no substantive agreement be reached during the first surge. This is not a tactic of delay. It is an acknowledgement that the conditions of the surge are not conditions for accurate decision. Naming the request aloud, even briefly, is a form of cognitive stabilization. "You need a full budget review by tomorrow morning" is more useful than a nodding response to a rapid delivery. Naming the request slows the transmission by introducing a pause into the exchange. It also confirms understanding, which matters, because urgency frequently compresses communication in ways that leave the actual request ambiguous. The named request can be corrected if it was misunderstood. The merely absorbed request produces a commitment to something that may not even be what was intended. Requesting the facts that the urgency obscured is the next move. What is the specific deadline? Who set it? What happens if it is missed, and what portion of this requires the viewer specifically? These questions do not challenge the other person's distress. They examine the situation that the distress is about. In most cases, the other person will provide the facts readily. They are distressed, not evasive. The facts are available. The evaluation was simply not being requested before the protocol introduced it. The safety exception remains active throughout the protocol. At any point during the evaluation, if the facts reveal immediate physical danger, medical urgency, or acute crisis, the protocol suspends and safety takes priority. The questions asked in the protocol are exactly what identifies whether that threshold has been reached. When the answer to "what happens if this waits" is "someone is at risk right now," the protocol has done its job. The response is no longer a borrowed urgency question. It is an emergency response. Stating a review time, a specific named point at which the full response will be delivered, closes the first step of the protocol. It uses the holding response established in an earlier chapter of the register. I have your request, and I'll give you a clear answer by noon today. The review time is realistic, not punitive. It is specific, not vague. It serves both parties by creating a defined window for evaluation, rather than either an immediate commitment or an open-ended silence. After the first step of the protocol creates the evaluation interval, the ownership audit runs in the space that has been protected. The first question of the audit identifies whose consequence is at stake. The consequence may be professional, relational, health-related, financial, or logistical. Whoever experiences the primary consequence is the first candidate for primary ownership. If that person is not you, if the primary consequence would be experienced by someone else in their professional situation, their relationship, or their financial standing, then you are being invited into a support role, not a primary one. Authority is the second element. Who has the actual standing to make the decision that resolves the situation? This question locates ownership more precisely than consequence alone, because in some situations, the consequence is genuinely shared even when the authority is clearly assigned to one party. A junior team member and a senior one may both experience consequence from a failed project, but the authority to make the critical decision rests with the senior party. The viewer's appropriate role in that situation is advisory or supportive, not primary, regardless of their capacity. Capability assessment is the third element, and its primary function is to identify whether the owner can manage the situation with appropriate support rather than requiring substitution. A person who is capable, with access to relevant information and the authority to act, but who is seeking to transfer ownership because management feels uncomfortable, is in a different situation from a person who is genuinely unable to manage without the viewer's specific involvement. The distinction shapes what kind of assistance is appropriate. Capable people with appropriate authority are best served by support and confidence. People with genuine capacity gaps are best served by the specific assistance those gaps require, combined with access to any professional resources the situation warrants. Defining the viewer's duty, the portion of the situation that legitimately belongs to them, completes the ownership assignment. The duty may be small and specific, or it may be substantial in a situation where the viewer's role genuinely includes primary responsibility. What the protocol asks is that the duty be identified rather than assumed, stated rather than left implicit, and bounded rather than open-ended. A clearly defined duty can be honored. An absorbed expectation cannot be held at a consistent boundary because it was never defined in the first place. Assistance, once the ownership is correctly assigned, takes a specific form. The bounded contribution described in the earlier section on helping without inheriting. Its definition within the protocol is a named portion with a named timeline. What you will contribute, when you will contribute it, and what remains with the owner, these three elements make the assistance offer complete and actionable. Returning remaining responsibility to the owner is the final element of ownership assignment. This return may take the form of a clear statement. The submission itself and the deadline tracking from this point are yours to manage. I'll have the reviewed draft to you by Thursday afternoon. The statement is not a withdrawal of care. It is an accurate accounting of what was absorbed without authorization and what is now being returned to the person who owns the consequence. The return is the act of trust implicit in the protocol, the belief that the owner can manage their portion if it is clearly named and returned. With the ownership correctly assigned and the facts clearly established, the final step of the protocol is the actual decision about your response. The options are 4: act immediately, schedule the action, arrange for delegation, or decline. None of these is inherently right or wrong. The protocol does not assign a default response. It provides the conditions under which the appropriate response becomes clear, rather than being determined by whoever communicated most recently with the most urgency. Stating the decision clearly, once made, is the step most often weakened under social pressure. The instinct towards softening, hedging the decision with apologies, qualifications, and extended explanations, is understandable and often kind in motivation. It does not serve either party. A clear statement of what will happen, when and under what conditions, is more useful than an elaborate justification that invites negotiation with the very pressure that the protocol was designed to interrupt. I can have this to you by Thursday. The deadline tracking and the final submission are yours. That statement is complete. It does not require defense. Protecting the priorities displaced by the decision requires an explicit step when the decision is immediate action. If urgent engagement is warranted, and the review has confirmed it, the displacement it creates needs to be acknowledged and managed. What moves? Who is informed of the shift? Is there an adjustment in expectation owed to another party whose commitment is now displaced? These questions transform a reactive yes into a deliberate yes, one that acknowledges its own cost and manages it. Preparing for pressure after the decision is delivered means expecting that the response may not satisfy the person who transmitted the urgency. The disappointment or frustration that follows a bounded offer is not evidence that the decision was wrong. It is evidence that the person was expecting something different. Maintaining the decision under that pressure, returning once to the original statement if clarity is needed, without repeated renegotiation, is the skill that the protocol's earlier steps prepare for. The decision was reached through evaluation. The pressure is not new information. It does not warrant a different decision. Documenting recurring patterns is a practical long-term element of the protocol. When the same source generates borrowed urgency repeatedly, when the same deadline structure appears month after month, when the same emotional mechanism is activated reliably by the same relationship, that pattern deserves to be written somewhere, not as a grievance but as a factual record. Patterns that are documented can be addressed structurally. Patterns that are only experienced remain invisible as patterns and appear as individual incidents each time, which is precisely how they sustain themselves. The review conducted after an urgency event has passed is where learning occurs. What was the actual situation? What did the response cost? Was the ownership correctly assigned? Did the boundary hold or did it collapse? If it collapsed, what produced the collapse? And what would have needed to be different to hold it? The review is not a performance evaluation, it is a navigation instrument. The comparison between what was intended and what actually occurred, used to adjust the next iteration of the protocol. Emergency channels, the specific designated means for genuine urgency that overrides the cadence, should be reviewed regularly. If they are being used frequently by the same parties for situations that consistently fail the ownership audit, the review surfaces that fact. Either the emergency channel is not defined narrowly enough, or the conversation about appropriate use has not yet occurred, or the relationship as a whole requires a different kind of attention. The channel is a component of a system. Its performance is information about the system. That opening message, the one that arrived mid-sentence, mid-bite, mid-thought, is still sitting in the register. It has not been answered yet. But now there is a decision about it rather than a reaction, and that difference is what the register was always designed to produce. Epilogue. The hour returns. The phone is in your hand. The message that arrived at the beginning of this volume is still there, unchanged in its words. The same urgency, the same compressed language, the same implicit claim that whatever was happening before this moment needs to stop. Everything about the message is the same. What has changed is the person reading it. The register has been opened. The questions exist now that did not exist before. Whose deadline is this, really? Who experiences the consequence if nothing happens? Is there immediate safety at stake? And if not, does the situation warrant the speed at which it arrived? These questions move through the reading of the message with a different quality than the original physical acceleration did. Not coldness, no distance from the person on the other side of the message, but steadiness. The ability to see the situation before the body has already committed to a speed that the situation may not require. The choice made from that steady position is not always the same as the choice that would have been made under surge. Sometimes the evaluation confirms genuine urgency, and the response that follows is all the more effective for being chosen rather than absorbed. Sometimes the evaluation finds an inconvenience wearing urgency's clothes, and the holding response, the clarifying question, the bounded offer, or the returned responsibility becomes the appropriate next action. The master loop that opened this register resolves here, not with a final answer that applies to every situation, but with the capacity to find the accurate answer in each one. Responsible availability means being genuinely reachable for the situations that warrant it, within the conditions that keep the availability sustainable. It is not permanent readiness. It is not unlimited absorption. It is not the erasure of your own priorities in the service of everyone else's distress. It is, simply, the capacity to be present and useful within a structure that belongs to your own judgment, not to whoever communicated most recently with the most emotional force. Another person is allowed to carry their urgency. They are allowed to remain anxious after a boundary has been communicated. They are allowed to disagree with the assessment and to feel frustrated by the response. Their internal state is their own. And one of the most fundamental recognitions the register offers is this: their clock does not have to become your clock. You can remain present without being captured. You can care without inheriting the emergency. The borrowed hour can be returned, carefully, completely, and without the coldness that would make the return cruel. Before this volume is set down, the register offers its reader one final question, one that stays private, requires no audience, and needs no immediate resolution. Among the recurring sources of borrowed urgency in your life, which one would you name as the most consistent? The colleague, the family member, the relationship, the role, the situation that most reliably sends its clock into your body before your judgment has been consulted. Leave a note somewhere if you like, not as an accusation of anyone, but as the beginning of the structural attention that the pattern deserves. There is a companion volume in this series whose territory connects directly to the work begun here. Once you have begun to identify what belongs to you and what was borrowed, a quieter and more persistent question tends to surface. Why does familiar difficulty sometimes feel more bearable than an unfamiliar life that might actually fit? Why does a person return repeatedly to a pattern they can already name? Not because they are unaware of it, but because the known discomfort carries a kind of safety that the untested alternative does not. That question is the subject of the next volume. The familiarity that keeps a borrowed clock running is worth examining. The register will be there when you are ready,